Hello, it's me. We're streaming as as usual on Wednesday afternoons. Um, I guess it's before noon right now. It's still morning. We have 7 minutes because, as you say, Ishmael, we're early. Early, maybe. I don't know. That's only if on time is strictly when stream is scheduled for, right? I feel like I just presume myself that like sometimes I'll start, you know, 15 minutes earlier than that, maybe 5 minutes later sometimes. But yeah, we're reading poetry today, probably, right? Um is the hope. Lotus. I'm joining a group program for neurodivergent people. Not sure if I said that here already. I don't think you said that here already because that's new to me, and I think that's good. That sounds responsible and like a healthy thing to do, and I think I'm supportive of the idea of just people doing things like that, finding community, having people to talk about like the real shit with. I think that can be hard outside of the organized setting, right? And welcome in, Nikki. I hope you all are well. Uh, I'm like I feel like I was sort of hesitant to stream today, like to go live at all. Um, and I think maybe that's why I started like I guess slightly early, if that's what we want to call it, to just like kind of force myself into it. Not that I like don't want to, because I like streaming. I've just been thinking a lot about like what I'm doing on stream and how to organize that and how to approach it in the best way possible. And like I've been slightly maybe dissatisfied with my streams lately. I think just in how I personally approach like the reading poetry analysis kind of deal, right? That's just not something that I find that I necessarily feel I'm doing very well lately is like the actual reading people's poetry part and the actual like teaching and having the balance between stuff and like keeping variety and keeping myself um always maybe uh like doing something different. I feel like streams have been very like autopilot for the last couple months and that's not exactly what I want because I don't think that's a good maybe frame of mind to be in if I'm reading someone else's poetry, right? Like I should be actively engaging with stuff. Um, so that's been on my mind even before last stream where sort of that maybe specifically came up in an immediate manner. Face your fear. Howdy. Welcome. Um, we very well might read uh your poem today because like you're new and that's cool. We might read something else depending on whether you want me to look at it or who else kind of trickles in, but always partial to new people and different things and that sort of uh yeah, variation. So yeah, y'all are crazy with your like what 10 stream watch streaks and 7 stream watch streaks, Ishmael and Nikki. Uh that's pretty cool to me that y'all like watch my stream with such regularity. That there can be like that degree of continued I guess interest in what I'm doing. I mean, it's reassuring, that that's kind of cool to me. Uh good content is good content. Long watch streaks make sense. Thank you. um, I yeah, I guess that makes sense. I guess I still wonder, sometimes, a lot of the time, whether this is like good and worth watching and that kind of stuff. And maybe it's that I'm not really like preoccupied with that idea of creating something good and creating something, you know, like necessarily so audience oriented, that I really actually don't think that much about um, what I'm doing. I have been thinking about like the analysis and the reading, but that's really only to like make sure it's as good as possible in terms of like the educational value and the um, my own engagement with the work. I don't know. It's a balance. But I won't even tell you my watch streak with EJ. I mean, you don't have to. I think that's cool. I think that's cool. And maybe part of it is that like uh, Twitch isn't a platform that I watch very much of their content on. So, but like I imagine, right, there are probably people who watch Twitch to the same extent that like other people, maybe me, would like watch stuff on YouTube, where I feel like I open YouTube a lot and very frequently. And if someone was, opening Twitch on a even a daily basis, then it would be pretty reasonable to have watch streaks going on. It's just not something I do, right? Twitch is like a rare occasion for me to watch, usually just for a few minutes after I raid people. Uh, you know, so there's that. That also means I don't know that much about what content is like on Twitch and what is good content, bad content, all of that kind of stuff. You get notified when creators go live. I guess that probably helps too, right? That does make sense. So yeah, I feel like I'm a very like notifications off person. My Discord is always on like do not disturb. Uh, I really try to like you know be using like opening Instagram very infrequently. Uh, no notifications from like any YouTube channels or Twitch or that kind of stuff. Very just like off social media. And then I mean like I don't use a smartphone. I use a flip phone to try to like keep this like online stuff like on my computer, so I don't have to be bothered by Instagram, Discord, YouTube when I'm, out and about, like living my actual life. So I guess maybe I try to engage with it in a different manner, right? And that could definitely change my perception. Uh yeah. um I don't know. I don't necessarily feel like yapping too much. I kind of want to just jump right into poetry. Uh, Also, because I think today is going to be a bit of a shorter stream, I'm probably just going to read one work and then dip, because I want to go to. I have a friend who kind of weekly just like hosts people to just kind of show up at their house. It's kind of open to like hang out and work or like jam and play music. It's just like every Wednesday they're like, yeah, if you want to pull up, anyone kind of can. So I'd like to go to that after stream because that's very very cool. They're kind of cultivating, uh, I would say something resembling an actual like third space, just using their home, which is super cool. Um, so yeah, shorter stream today, straight into poetry. Uh, and yeah, face your fear. Are you cool with me reading your poem? Life is not but a game of chance on this stream today. If not, we can defer to like Nikki or Ishmael maybe. So there's like no pressure either way. That sounds nice. I wish I felt comfortable working with other people. I see a lot of people derive a lot from it. Yeah, I mean like quite honestly, I work much worse with other people. Like I get less done because I tend to talk to the people around me, and it is like maybe 50% social, 50% work. But I mean, one, I feel like in that setting it's more enjoyable, so sometimes I can sit and work for longer, which maybe even balances it out. But then also just, I think it's good sometimes uh to just have social stuff. I don't know how much like my situation where it lands relative to other people, but I don't get to socialize that much. And maybe it's because like high school and college are still very recent memories for me where you'd like go somewhere on a very regular basis and like be able to continually socialize with people for an extended amount of time. And then like now that I'm, back home, it's like socialization has to be a very actively pursued thing, and uh, that's very difficult. So lately, I've been doing a lot of like just trying to schedule things to like spend time with people I like, because I think I don't know if this is how most people's lives are, which I think it is, like spending most of one's time in settings that aren't particularly social. Uh, it's quite sad, right? It's a very sad way to live. To like be very alone and be very isolated. I think many people are. I think I am. So that's like the world we live in. Uh, I can't get anything done unless I'm at my own desk. Lol. Sorry for the spam poetry we go. No need to apologize. I think, you know, the whole point of chat is to distract me from just entirely spending time locked in on poetry. And the other point of chat is to like give awesome, helpful ideas about poetry. Um, but like, no, I mean, uh, stream isn't so focused, right? Will be interesting to see what you find in my old piece. It's not as formulaic. Okay, that's cool. I do like things that take a different direction. I see you have these really long lines happening, and that's I think that's something a lot of people avoid in poetry. The long line, and I think especially like in the modern time, uh, like the phenomena of insta poetry like really stretched the extent to which we can use like very short lines in writing, where it was like we're just going to take like a pretty regular sentence and like put it on across 12 lines. um I mean that's a little, I mean I think that's like an acceptable amount of demeaning for insta poetry. um but um yeah, the long line is not something that's very like appreciated or prevalent. And to show you all what I'm talking about, because I just got the poem onto my screen. um nope, black screen. Gotta deal with OBS. my my toxic lover. What does OBS stand for? Is that like something broadcast studio online broad o online broadcast studio? That would kind of make sense, right? I have no idea though. Something like that. Yeah, I really I get probably far too much enjoyment in life. I mean, if one's getting enjoyment, it's not like far too much. I get a lot of enjoyment in my life looking at acronyms and trying to figure out what they mean without looking them up. I think it's sort of a nice like language exercise just in general. Um, Cause yeah, I don't know. I just do that. uh, yeah, long lines. Long lines. This is I mean certainly like uh I guess I would say like unpleasant for stream. Not not being like mean to you, face your fear. Uh because I have to like scroll all the way to the side and it's quite difficult and it zooms it far out. Like my short line kings, you know, I can zoom into like this level or closer and like the whole line will stay on the screen. Uh but you know, that doesn't change the merit of this as a poem. It just changes the way I interface with it in this specific medium. Should I edit it beneath to be more suitable? No. If this is the way that your poem is presented, then this is like the right way for me to read your poem. And I wouldn't want to, uh, you know, sort of change that because this is, you know, this is how you've presented your art to me. And you even say, you know, it has a more long, elongated type flow of it, right? So, you know, this is clearly a very intentional bit of the poem. So, you know, we're gonna read it as is. Yeah, long lines. Something to think about. um if you have any questions, comments, context ahead of the poem, feel free to share it. If you'd like me to go into it with a uninfluenced mind, that's also okay. Either way, I'm going to start reading. Life is not but a game of chance. Okay. Life is not but a game of chance. Akin to the cast of a die, once thrown, one ought to die. Despite its eyes, it was unable to see, whereas the ending, it has always been foreseen. He who once was shall some day be no more. There was no tally, no one kept score. Eternal silence was the final encore. All shared a fate to fade. Choice? There was none. Foregone was the conclusion. Creation's due, one ought to recall, was thereafter the hereafter. Loss or gain? Equal to blind die, O death reaped thine beloved and hated alike. Destiny claimed and maimed, called and mauled, bereaved and retrieved. Neither purpose nor calling was of consequential matter, be they hero, villain, or passer-by. Some day those had unwillingly come to, and some day those would inadvertently come to perish. Such tragedy, pre-written, such barbarism, directed, such is life. The tale of being was one of infinite possibilities, but with solely one direction to take. It was so and would be so. Different beginnings marked the same definitive ending. An actor's visage remained interchangeable. The curtain call, the callous claim, that did not differentiate amidst the parts played. The circle of life was nothing more than a direct pathway towards oblivion. As such, death was not the game of chance. Akin to the cast of a loaded die, once thrown, answer. Someone had to answer. It was clear for everyone to see. Don't you see? The ending is foreseen. He who just is was soon to be no more. So I ask you, What is it for? Life is not but a game of chance. So we have this like direct question at the reader, which is sort of fun, right? We shift at the end here toward like a second person breaking the fourth wall kind of thing, which I think, you know, isn't always the most common thing to do in poetry, and isn't always the most common thing to do in, I think, poetry like this that leans philosophic, right? I would say it firmly stands within that realm. Uh, to like break that fourth wall is kind of, I don't know, unusual. I think the philosophic poetry tends to stay within the constraints of itself, like as far as I've usually seen. But yeah, um, I don't know. Like first thoughts. First thoughts is that these long lines are very, very long, and very it creates like an interesting thing. Like the longer a line is, like the more difficult a line break becomes to really like keep flow. Right. When we have like short lines, even if they're varied, right? Like line length like has a literal effect in reading where like it takes time to move your eyes from the end of this line to the start of this line, right? And you like lose some time during this process. It creates a natural temporal break, a bit of a discontinuity. And when we have like a line that goes all the way over here, even if I'm quite zoomed out, right? Where is the ending? It has always been foreseen. He who once was shall someday be no more. Like, I literally can't kind of read this out loud without having a significant break. It's a little bit easier, maybe within one's mind, um, or like reading in one's head. Like you don't have to take nearly as long of a break, but that's something that happens. I will say the long lines are a bit intense personally, make it harder to read IMO. I think there are cool moments that lose power because of the lines, but maybe that's also because of the need to scroll here. Yeah, the scrolling is a particular like difficulty that's created within this medium. Uh, and maybe I can read it again and keep it zoomed out, and they'll still affect the flow, um, but it'll be a little bit less, and we can compare and see how that's any different. Not sure how I would read it if I could see the full lines at once. Yeah, and I guess I'll give it a shot, and we'll see, and yeah, maybe that's just something we can talk about in this, because poems can always teach us something. It's a useful question to ask when reading. What can this teach us? And poems can teach us things that we think are like very good and very well done. They can also teach us things that we think are like less effective. So we can look at like, oh, something was effective in the poem or something was not effective. And this can give us an idea of how we want to approach poetry in the future. And within this poem, I think something that we're already having some, that our attention is called to is the idea of line length, as well as just the concept of a line break and what that does. And I think maybe this poem in particular probably has something to teach us about both of these things, right? So I'll read it again. Life is not but a game of chance. Life is not but a game of chance, akin to the cast of a die. Once thrown, one ought to die. Despite its eyes, it was unable to see, whereas the ending it has always been foreseen. He who once was shall someday be no more. There was no tally. No one kept score. Eternal silence was the final encore. All shared a fate to fade. Choice? There was none. For gone was the conclusion. Creation's due one ought to recall was there after the hereafter. Loss or gain, equal to blind die, oh, death reaped thine beloved and hated alike. Destiny claimed and maimed, called and mauled, bereaved and retrieved. Neither purpose nor calling was of consequential matter. Be they hero, villain, or passer-by, some day those had unwillingly come to, and some day those would inadvertently come to perish. Such tragedy, pre-written, such barbarism, directed, such is life. The tale of being was one of infinite possibilities, but with solely one direction to take. It was so and would be so. Different beginnings marked the same definitive ending. An actor's visage remained interchangeable. The curtain call, the callous claim, that did not differentiate amidst the parts played. The circle of life was nothing more than a direct pathway towards oblivion. As such, death was not the game of chance. Akin to the cast of a loaded die once thrown, answer. Someone had to answer. It was clear for everyone to see. Don't you see the ending is foreseen? He who just is was soon to be no more. So I ask you, what is it for? Life is not but a game of chance. So we get a very different feeling, first of all, when I'm reading, when I can see the whole line. Like, I wasn't paying nearly as close attention on the first read when I was like scrolling back and forth. But it does have a different effect, I would say, within the poem when I can like a little bit more confidently go into the next one. Because when I was scrolling, there was like this big pause and then this sudden like, oh, here's the line, now I'm gonna say it. And I think it felt very off kilter. It felt very odd, right, the first time. I think with this time it does something a little different when I read it the second time. And so I underlined 4 things here, right? 4 of them are at the start of the line. 1 is over here at the end of the line, because I think they're sort of doing the same thing. Well, these are all doing the same thing. And then this is kind of a variation on the theme. So in the case of each of these long lines, right, we end it like in the middle of a sentence. So we have a fragment, right? He who. And then this one we have, O death reaped thine beloved and. In this one, an actor's visage. In this one, don't you see the ending is. And even when I just read those, I think there's some feeling that comes across of like what's next. Like we want to know what's next. Don't you see the ending is? I think the mind automatically asks the ending is what when I stop in the middle of a sentence, right? Like it breaks the normal flow of language, and that creates something really interesting that happens. It creates a feeling of anticipation. And I did it a couple more times there just in my sentences because I think it really illustrates that quite well. That when we just cut off in the middle of something, then it really piques our interests and makes us want to know like what's going to happen next. So, right, we're creating anticipation. I think the anticipation breaks down a little bit with like the really awkward feeling of having to scroll. But I think when it's read zoomed out like this, it felt more like that anticipation was effective because one can sort of like pace that motion to the next line, maybe. Uh, but then we like do something different in the third instance of like our long lines, which is we do end on a period, and I think this makes this one like stick out pretty strongly in the poem because we even do this like come to ellipsis. There's supposed to be like some amount of suspension here, but then we like land on perish within the same line, uh which is interesting. Like it's an interesting thought looking at this and saying, like why uh letters, why is this one different, right? Like why would the poet choose to kind of break the pattern here? Because it really does stick out in that capacity. And then why would the poet choose to break the pattern while still sort of maintaining the pattern of like this ellipsis of suspense and then like a final letter? This ellipsis could kind of be replaced with just hitting the enter key, right? So this is creating a lot of interest at the end of the lines and then at the start of the lines. Uh, Whether it's good, whether it detracts, right? Whether it makes it harder to read, whether it being harder to read is a good thing or a bad thing, uh, is a whole nother question, right? But it is something very clear that happens. So I think then, like, considering the end of these lines, he who, it's important then to talk about where we're landing. Once was, and then we have beloved and hated alike. We have an actor's visage, remained unchangeable. We have don't you see the ending is foreseen. Right, these are like, I don't know, they're very important, I guess. I think they're the most interesting thing happening in the poem, in my opinion. Uh, I don't know how to like phrase what I'm trying to like say or get at though, which is sort of annoying. Maybe it's worth asking you all like upon that second reading and upon thinking about it a little bit more, like what we think about these lines and like whether the second read did kind of, whether it felt different, whether it felt harder or easier or more friendly. All good. If you do have questions, feel free to ask. Yeah, I think I'm good on like, I don't think I need anything more from you right now. 'Cause like I'm just trying to figure out how to approach this from like my own perspective, uh, answering this question involves, uh, coming toward an answer, but then also like getting there and like making a roadmap very immediately, right? Okay. Second reading was a lot nicer for me. I agree. It was nicer for me too. And at the first stages of the analysis here, there are parts of the poem that really grab me, but the lines are still a bit jarring for me. And I mean this in the nicest way possible. I know what it's like to get insecure when people read your stuff. Not sure if a restructuring could solve, or maybe if there's a need to cut. But cutting obviously is a strong thing to ask the author to do. Right. So we have we have this feeling of jarring. We have this feeling of like an impact. I think this is what I felt, and it's why I was underlining these four lines, is we land really heavily on them, is like there's so much suspense with the length of the line that we like catapult back to the start, and it really lands there. And I think, these emotional words are good, right? Impact. Emotional words like jarring. Because what we've done here is, just by the structure of this poem, right? Face Your Fear has done something really interesting. They've created an emotional response, you know, like, I mean, sort of like regardless of what the words are saying, right? Is like, it's really jarring to jump back to the start of the line. And, one of our big goals in poetry, one of our big objectives, maybe, is, right, to make people feel, or to convey our own emotion, or to get, to get feelings across. I think most people would probably like to write something and have someone read it and like feel, right? Some of like the best moments are when I read something and someone's like, wow, that made me like cry. That made me feel this way. That impacted me in a certain manner, right? That stuff's a big deal. And the fact that we've created a feeling on the page of jarring is really, it should be very exciting to us. Like, as poets, as even analysts here, that seemingly we've come across a technique, right, that can create a feeling of jarring, right? And like heavy impact. Because in our own poems, we can go and say, I want to write something that leans into jarring, that leads, like really leans into like surprise and just like crashing back into the beginning of the line and just, ugh, right? Intense. So the question then with this poem, or the question that like the poet particularly might ask themselves, but we can also ask, is a feeling of jarringness or being jarred good here, right? Does it help the poem, do what the poem's doing? And this is sort of the tricky thing about analysis, is like, we have to come to understand, like, maybe what is this poem trying to do, or what we think it's trying to communicate. And then we can ask if being jarred and being flung from the right side of the page to the left is beneficial here, right? We're talking about death. We're talking about a game of chance. And in the first line, right, life is not but a game of chance, akin to the cast of a die. Once thrown, one ought to die. Like, we've created in our first two sentences within this line. It's funny to have multiple sentences within a line. That's not something we can normally talk about in poetry. I feel like sentence usually exists longer than line. It's kind of novel. We've painted death as something very arbitrary, right? The die gets rolled, it lands on the natural one, you get hit by a bus, you're dead. Right? This is sort of the idea we've presented about life, is like we can just die. And I mean, if we think about, just getting hit by a bus, that's a pretty jarring thing, right? So the poem is talking about something that's fundamentally like a surprise that comes out of nowhere and just ends things, right? Um, Despite its eyes, it was unable to see, whereas the ending it has always been foreseen, right? This is like, we're wandering blindly, with the only certainty being a death, but we don't know when that death comes. He who, it's almost like in that moment we die once was, right? Bam, death. Shall someday be no more. Um, like, and I think like the high concept idea of this poem of death just happening, on like a big thematic level, really fits with like the jarringness of this literal like technique of enjambment. That's a word Nikki used earlier in chat, I think. Um, Enjambment, which is just the technical word for like the use of line breaks and that kind of stuff. I think you set it up here. I do think the passage of time could still be shown through using well-placed enjambments to add pauses and breaths. Yeah, it definitely can show the passage of time, and that is maybe something else that's happening here, right? Is there's literal time and there's space, that passes between who and once was. I'm not sure this poem is so like literally narrative though, but it's a good thought, right? Um, it also has a very old-fashioned feel to it, which I do like. That's interesting. To me, I feel like, I don't know, like old-fashioned to me very much evokes like formal stuff, right? Verse, uh, poetry at certain periods. I mean, it depends on how old we're talking, right? Um, right, that like this is a very free verse poem, right? The fact that we can play with such long lines and short lines, um, at least to me, right? But everyone has a different definition of old fashioned. I think that's cool. I will tell you guys why I did write it once we're through. Excellent. That's always fun to hear. I've never even thought of using the structure of a poem itself in this kind of way to try to further an emotional response, assuming it's deliberate. Yeah. Um, oh, yeah. And then Nikki. Oh, yeah. Playing with white space is one of my favorites. So, yeah. And one thing you say here, reclusy, which always catches my eye, right? Assuming it's deliberate. Assuming oh my gosh, I can't write today. We're just gonna say deliberance. I don't know if that's a word, but right, like to say, okay, this thing makes me feel in a certain way based on the structure, and then asking the question, is that intentional? Is that being used by the poet in a certain way to evoke something particular? And something I think is, I don't know, like a law of mine, a commandment, if you will, of analysis. I don't know. I don't have that many commandments, I don't think. But one is this, right? You look at the page, and when I read something, when I'm looking at a poem, I just assume that every single thing I notice is a deliberate choice, and has been put, by the poet, like, for some effect. I also think it's like a very delusional take, because I also write poetry, and I know that most of the time, like, everything I do is not being done with any sort of deliberance. However, if we do this, I think it just makes the um, act of analysis more interesting. This maybe just makes it more fun because when I notice something cool, right? Like we read a poem, we notice something cool that happens. And I think it's much more enjoyable to look at that and just say, wow, that's really cool. The poet did something awesome here. And I want to give them credit for that because, like, props to them. They did something awesome. If I read the poem and I have to take the step of, like, oh, this really cool thing happened, uh, oh, maybe that was just an accident, right? I think to me, I think it's just less enjoyable because it takes away um, the sort of credit from the poet that I think I would like to give if I'm reading someone's stuff. I guess that makes me like an optimist fundamentally, right? But yeah, structure of a poem is something we absolutely can use and can leverage as a technique for certain things, right? And I mean, right, what can this teach us? That fact alone is something really valuable just to know. Um, and I think, the idea of enjambment in particular is very central to the idea of time. Uh, the way that we use enjambment literally affects how our reader moves through the poem temporally, right? Uh, and so then it can concern a lot of emotions that are maybe related to time, right? Suspense, the idea of like flow slash motion, which maybe isn't a feeling, uh, but using line breaks can make something feel frantic as opposed to calm. It can make something feel very curt and like cut off and blunt, or it can make something feel very like song-like and musical and flowing. So this is generally the realm that I think enjambment puts us in emotionally, is that of time. And then any of these emotions, hope, I think is a big one, right? I think maybe you could make a poem feel more hopeful with where it places line breaks versus, um, or, just where it places line breaks, because hope is a sort of temporal emotion that makes you want to look forward. And enjambment creates suspense. Hope is like, an optimistic suspense, right? So, yeah, it's something that happens. Agree. Highlighted as a critique initially has now become a compliment of sorts. However, I do think there are risks in being too charitable, but I also think the structure aspect has made this analysis more interesting and informative. Yeah, I mean, I I'm curious as to what you think the risks are of being too charitable. Um, and I mean like in a practical sense, like what is actually maybe being risked by that. Um, right. It's an interesting thought. um, but yeah, it like assuming the structure is intentional has made this more interesting, has given us more to think about, and I think that's mostly why we do analysis, right? Analysis is very thinky, and so we should give ourselves like the liberty to think, I guess. Welcome in, Ray. Welcome in. Um, yeah, Okay, so that's some thoughts on enjambment. This is my academic side coming through strongly. Yeah, I think that makes sense. So we can come back to the poem now, and maybe we can look at each of these lines, or each of these phenomena, these end line massive jumps within context. And, we can decide if that feeling of being jarred is helping this poem or not, right? Um, and maybe that's one way we can sort of gauge, uh, if we want to, whether something is intentional. Um, yeah, this is another important aside, right? Um, Something I talk about often is this idea of something being effective, whether it's like working toward like the overarching idea of the poem, whether it's contributing to the overall effect, right? Um, and I think maybe another word that like literally just thought of for this is the idea of harmony in a work. I think that might actually be like a better word than effectiveness, is whether something has harmony with the rest of the work. Uh so let's say the whole work is very short and clipped and has a lot of motion and that kind of stuff. Uh then when we look at an effect, maybe a use of line breaks that contributes to this curtness, we could say it sort of has harmony with the rest of the work. And then, we bring in a line within that is very long and flowing and stretched out over an entire breath and doesn't have that same kind of curtness and break and that kind of stuff, right? Um, that line, maybe we could argue, no longer has harmony with the rest of the poem, uh, and maybe feels out of place. And maybe that's where we could think of, oh, that's not something the author intentionally did. Of course, we can then like double down and say it was an intentional choice to create contrast against like the brokenness of the prior part. Um, and all of that is usually like one could probably then reference the meaning of the words and the other like sound things going on, and that might help one decide if it is harmonic or not, so to speak. Um, and what I mean like that, so how we could think about this within this poem, right? Uh, is it's like a really hard, it's a very circular kind of thing to talk about and think about. Um, Words. um, Feels very interesting as an author slash writer to view this. I would think it would be, right? Uh, from what I can tell, people seem to have interest when I read their work. Uh, I've never, ever been on the other side of it, so I can't personally relate, though. Which is, I don't know, maybe it's sad. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Um, so, trying to bring this back to the poem. So we can look at these individual lines, right? And this jarring effect of the line break. And, we can ask, like, when we land on these words and are jarred by their presence and they, like, smash into us with unexpected force, right? Does that. Like, one thing we can think about is whether that works with the actual meaning of the sentences, because uh sometimes we have a sentence where one word is really the central operating part of it. And it could be very effective for us to, very harmonic, for us to take a sentence where, like, the last word in it is very surprising and jarring and exciting, and then combine that with a technique like these line breaks to heighten the jarring feeling of that word, right? And that's where that idea of maybe like harmony comes in. If we take something jarring, we increase its jarringness with our structural choices, then we've like created a harmony that brings these things together and like collectively heightens the effect of that emotion, right? That's what we would maybe want, especially with an emotion like jarring that we would really want to lean into. So I guess what I'm saying is we would be very excited if these words at the start of the line were surprising. If they took the sentence, if they took the line, if they took the sentence in a direction like we didn't expect. Because part of suspense is expectation. Like sometimes we know what word is going to come next and we just want to hear it. But if we subvert an expectation, then it might heighten the jarringness. Like that's something we can maybe like look for in these lines. So if we read them, right? Life is not but a game of chance, akin to the cast of a die. Once thrown, one ought to die. Despite its eyes, it was unable to see. Whereas the ending, it has always been foreseen. He who once was shall someday be no more. And then, like, the next one. I guess I'll just read through the poem, maybe. There was no tally. No one kept score. Eternal silence was the final encore. All shared a fate to fade. Choice. There was none. For gone was the conclusion. Creation's due one ought to recall. Thereafter, the hereafter. Loss or gain, equal to blind die. O death reaped thine beloved and hated alike. Like this one maybe surprises me. I don't know, like maybe I'd think, oh, death reaped thine beloved and, something continuing in that vein of positivity, but then we go like hated. Not sure. There is contrast between those words. The tale, I'll keep reading straight through. Destiny claimed and maimed, called and mauled, bereaved and retrieved. Neither purpose nor calling was of consequential matter, be thy hero, villain, or passer-by. Some day those had willingly come to, and some day those would, inadvertently, come to perish. We have something like happening in a lot of these lines where something like feels finished and then it like still kind of desires to continue. Hero, so we have like neither purpose or calling was of consequential matter, be thy hero, villain, or passer by, right? This like by creates a really like awkward and unexpected flow in the line, in the same way that those had willingly come to and someday those would inadvertently come to, right? Come to would be like the repetition of that same thing and maybe the end of that phrase, but then we go ... perish. So we're doing this thing in other places in the poem, even within these long lines, not just at the end, of like a weird suspension and a weird hiccup of motion that like just makes it feel really uncertain and really awkward. And then some of these things like creation's due when ought to recall was thereafter the hereafter period loss or gain question mark. Like we have like these fragments, we have these like weird drawn out sequences of things connected by commas, uh and then like these like rhyming repetitions that really jump out at us. And it really feels like the poem like is communicating a really uh this really, I mean, jarring feeling of like having flowing motion and then breaking it, and then having some amount of flow and then breaking it, and then like giving us something to expect, and then, going in a different direction. And the whole thing does feel off kilter. The whole thing does feel very awkward. And like, honestly, this poem is not sonically pleasant to read, in the same way that verse is pleasant. And you get this nice continuing flow of things in verse, and it moves forward like it's, it just has a very comfortable momentum. And many poems are really like pleasant in your mouth, and they just feel nice. They have that mouth feel, right? And this poem does not. And so then we ask the question, right? This poem feels kind of like icky in my mouth to read. Is that good or bad? Well, does that like harmonize with the idea of the poem? Does that contribute to the idea that life is not but a game of chance? Maybe, arguably, right? Like, we go back to that idea of like arbitrary changes of direction. Things can just happen that we don't understand and we don't see and we don't have control over, right? Um, like, that's uh, arguably effective, right? Such tragedy, pre-written, such barbarism, directed, such is life, right? We do this like such thing, colon, and then like such is life. We set up patterns and break them. The tale of being one of the infinite possibilities, but solely one direction to take, and so, and would be so. Um, Different beginnings marked by the same definitive ending, and actor's visage remained interchangeable. I find this one like maybe the least effective line break, where it's like it doesn't necessarily feel like it hits unsurprisingly. This also gets harder the longer I read it, because I'm starting to expect unexpected things, and like starting to know that it's going to feel jarring, and then that makes it feel less jarring. It's like knowing that a jump scare is going to happen, so it's no longer a jump scare. Um, I mean, sometimes you can know and they can still scare you, but it's like if you know exactly what's going to happen, like for the second time watching the movie, sometimes it stops being scary. The curtain call, the callous claim, that did not differentiate amidst the parts played. The circle of life was nothing more than a direct pathway toward oblivion. And this line is like really actually quite strange in the poem. It's like a sentence, it ends, it's very straightforward. Like, you know, like, it's like the most simple line in the poem. And this again, like, jumps out and breaks the form in a way that we don't expect, right? Such as death was not, and then like as such death was not the game of chance, like again breaks our expectation. um right, life is not but, right, and not but a is like, a pretty familiar phrase. But then like as such death was not the game of chance, like doesn't actually work really with this version of not, but we know what it's saying. Um, Akin to the cast of a loaded die once thrown, answer, right? Repeating the same thing and changing it. We've like, again, thrown off the reader. Someone had to answer. It was clear for everyone to see. Don't you see? The ending is foreseen. He who just is was soon to be no more. And we have these like really cool parallels where like foreseen is at the end of the line over here, then foreseen is at the start of the line way down here, and that's kind of cool, right? So I ask you, what is it for? Let me just like, I don't know, end on a very open question. There's cool things happening with like the rhythm and cadence and confusion. If I can return back to a comment made by a fellow chatter earlier, there are parts of the poem that give off a very old-fashioned feel. I love it. However, the old school feel is not consistent throughout, which adds to my jarring experience again. I'm being very critical, and I have no right to be. Sorry. Despite that, there are really strong moments in this poem, things I really fuck with heavily. I mean, Reclusa, you have every right to be very critical, right? I think when we are experiencing art and when we're talking about the art, it's much better to have opinions and much better to say that you like something or you don't like something, because if you decide you don't like something, that's very informative both to the writer, that's very informative to you and how you want to approach your own poetry in the future. Like if you don't know what you don't like, you're generally going to like struggle to grow, I think. And if you know what you like, you have something to move toward yourself. I think being critical and having opinions is like one of the most important things to improving, like having taste, whatever that taste is. I wouldn't say it's bad, but I love when poems, even with an icky meaning, have that nice mouthfeel to them. But that is personal preference. Some of my favorite poems are very icky subjects, but the mouth feels so good I can revisit it again and again. Yeah, and Nikki, you're like a very a sonically minded poet. You've said that. You've shared your work. That's like a very evident thing in your writing, and so I think it's interesting, right? We can have a poem be carried. I mean, either way, like even this poem in many ways is really supported, maybe, if you like the franticness of the mouthfeel. Like the mouthfeel is weird and awkward, and that adds to the poem in the same way that a poem might be really regular and very comfortable or assonant or alliterative, and then it adds to the poem. But it can also be one's opinion that it doesn't, right? And then it's like, oh, this pretty mouthfeel is with an icky subject. That feels too contrasting. I don't like it. You know, that's allowed. And one can say, like, this really awkward mouthfeel is not good. I don't like it. And, like, that's a totally fine answer or, like, opinion to hold, too, because it's art. It's subjective. So we should have opinions. And I think, you know, one of my big criteria of what makes me like a work is harmony. So if I can find, personally, a way that maybe an uncomfortable thing, like the pace of this poem, is harmonically beneficial, then I'll usually spin it to where I can like it. Because I usually want to like poetry, honestly. I don't like reading things to not like them. Like I want to feel uncomfortable with the fact that there is beauty in the darker aspects. Yeah, and like those contrasts can be really, really powerful. The last thing I wanted to ask, I missed a couple of minutes. Assuming the structural decisions are deliberate, have we reached a conclusion of whether the deliberate choice is effective? You know, so the conclusion of is something effective is always a subjective one. It's always a personal one. And, you know, we can like go through all of these things and like break them down and say like, you know, all of this might connect to the central idea, and it might still just not feel like it works. And that subjective, like, critical impulse is totally fine to, like, defer to and say, like, yeah, this just doesn't feel like it works. Um, cause like, yeah, effective is kind of a word for, like, do I like it, you know? um, Now, I am generally someone where when I find things that work together like this and have this harmony, I actually don't think these are very equivalent. Um, Harmony to me tends to, like, I don't know, be effective. Like, I enjoy that. I enjoy when this thing over here connects to this thing over here, and these, kind of feelings continue throughout the poem, and kind of relate to each other, bounce off of each other. Um, that's something I enjoy. That doesn't have to be something that everyone enjoys, and that's a very, like, important distinction to have. Welcome, Maitari, and and I guess three other viewers. Maybe I don't know if it counts you. Welcome in, Chef Marinara. Uh, we're currently reading a poem and having a very interesting discussion about uh, what what makes a poem effective, and uh, how we decide whether something is, like, good or not. I got a raid and run. That's okay, Maitari. Thank you for coming in. For those who don't know me, my name is Imogen. We read poetry on Twitch. Maitari has sent some of their poems to this stream on occasion, and we've read them before. Uh, and yeah, we just nerd out about words usually. um, so Reclusia, to come back to your question, um, you know, have we reached a conclusion of whether the deliberate choice is effective? I don't think we reach that conclusion collectively. And I would encourage you to reach your conclusion on your own. Any conclusion that I ever come to on this stream about poetry is about anything, really. Any conclusion we come to about anything is our own conclusion, right? Other people are absolutely welcome to agree with our conclusions. I like to try to make my conclusions about poetry, like, fairly logical, but those always exist within my subjective understanding of, like, what is logical and what is aesthetically good or bad or enjoyable, or anything like that, right? In the same way that we can ask whether a book of philosophy is effective. And it might be effective for some people because its ideas are very logically laid out. It might not be effective for some people because they find it unreadable and unenjoyable. And I think the same goes with poetry, right? Is any conclusion we come to is just our own. So you're welcome to agree with my conclusions. You're welcome to disagree with them. I personally think there's a lot of effective things about this idea of death being a surprise. This idea of, the die is thrown and it's unexpected and we're dead. And I think that contributes with this stumbling, arbitrary kind of feeling. Something I don't think personally is effective for me about the poem is this, like, ending fourth wall break, don't you see the ending is foreseen? What is it for? And I mean, there's a cool, like, Sonic parallel, right? You see foreseen, ask you what is it for? Like, there's a lot of cool language happening there. But like uh on a like a meaning level, this poem maybe uh like doesn't hit super hard for me in like some of the ways it's framing death, um and like some of this like circle of life, nothing more than a direct pathway toward oblivion. Like maybe on a line level, on a meaning level, these things like don't totally hit me in a way that I like emotionally vibe with. But like that's okay, right? Like a poem is allowed to be effective in certain ways for me and not effective in other ways. And, it's very rarely that even for one person, this poem is hitting on all cylinders. Um, there are very few poems I've ever read that do hit on all cylinders. So, um, it's a very I don't think it's usually something. It's not usually something we can answer very well. Is the poem effective? Is it not effective? We can ask if there are things that are effective, if it's more effective than it is not effective, um, in certain ways. And I think generally on this stream, I tend to try to highlight things about poems that do work in certain ways, because that's just more pleasant to me, right? It would probably be bad, just like if we're conceptualizing this, for me to go live on Twitch and talk about all the things that don't work in people's poetry. I think that might rub a lot of people the wrong way. Um, so I tend to lean into like the things that I vibe with, right? Um, whenever I can, right? So yeah. There's a lot of cool wordplay in this poem that I do like, even some simpler stuff that I appreciate. Yeah, and I think when we go back to this earlier question, what can something teach us? Um, I prefer to think about poems as what they can teach us to do, as opposed to what they teach us not to do, right? If I looked at every poem and highlighted the things that were wrong and said, okay, so I shouldn't do this in my poems, I would probably end up with a very, very narrow, restrictive kind of set of thoughts on how poetry works, right? But if I look at every poem and say, what can it teach me in a positive sense? What can it teach me to do in my poetry? Then every time I read something, what I am doing is like I am expanding my own conception of how writing can work. I'm expanding my own understanding of, techniques and ideas and, things I can do. And then that's just like throwing more and more tools into my toolbox, which then quickly becomes a tool shed, which then quickly becomes an entire Home Depot of literary techniques, right? So um, that's kind of the approach that I prefer to take. um, it's like a very, very like talking about it so much because it's an interesting question and thought, right? Um, yeah, I mean I think maybe that's a good place um to step back and maybe go back to you, face your fear, since I think you said that once I've, you know, given my thoughts, and I think I've given like some pretty cursory overarching thoughts on this poem. Um, Obviously if I let myself, I could probably talk about this for much longer. Um, but I think this is a good place to, ask if you want to fill in any of those what you were trying to do with this poem, like you said, you maybe wanted to share, or any of that. And then if anyone else has questions about the poem, questions for you, questions for me, thoughts, things I missed out on that maybe you want to highlight. If people have favorite parts or least favorite parts, those are always interesting things to hear, right? I agree with what you're saying. With that in mind, I also realize that given that I'm critical and that I've sent work before, I should probably post what I did share on the Discord for others to critique. If not, what I'm doing here, chat, is nothing but hypocrisy. However, I will deal with that after the stream. Super curious to hear the author's input. Yeah, I mean, I think a great thing about the sharing within the Discord channel is that like anyone can go read any of those poems and look at them themselves and have access to them. Um, but I think uh, maybe you're being a little harsh on yourself, because no matter what, if you share a poem and I read it on stream, um, then you are opening yourself up to various other critiques from people in chat. And I mean, last stream, Reclusi, like, it was Face My Fear who was giving you a lot of thoughts on your poem. So I wouldn't brand yourself so quickly as hypocrite, right? Yeah, the dice eye thing is pretty awesome. Face your fear. Um, yeah, because they can roll snake eyes. I didn't call it out particularly, but I did notice. Um, Interesting. The fun fact that is that this poem was not written as a poem in the first place. It was the opening chapter of my old novel, so it is more novel-esque in nature. I just added the "so I ask you" to make it feel more like poetry. Interesting. I mean, it feels so much like poetry with all like the wordplay, alliteration, like all that crazy stuff. Like you definitely have poetic prose if this is what you're doing, right? Um, Normally it goes into a car crash. Yeah. Okay, there you go. Same as getting hit by a bus, I suppose. And the biggest plot twist, this was written to mock said concept of death, hence the overt usage of purple prose. Ah, okay. I think that makes sense, and maybe that's why like some of the stuff on like a meaning level felt a little light to me, where like some of these individual ideas like did feel a little bit flat because it is like mocking them, right? Um okay. So I mean, if we life is not but a game of chance, akin to the cast of a die. Once thrown, one ought to die. Despite its eyes, it was unable to see. I could see this reading as prose, yeah. Whereas the ending, it has always been foreseen. He, who once was, shall someday be no more. It does feel like someone writing, like, very dramatic and very, like, kind of over the top, right? There was no tally. No one kept score. Eternal silence was the final encore. I mean, this feels like a very poetry line, though. Um, all shared a fate to fade. Choice? There was none. For gone was the conclusion. Like, that feels very prosaic. That makes sense. Creation's due, one ought to recall, was, thereafter, the hereafter. This feels like poetry shit. Um, Loss or gain? Equal to blind die. O death, reaped thine beloved and hated alike. Destiny claimed and maimed, called and mauled, bereaved and retrieved. I could see this being like sarcastic prose, but it also does feel like, you know, fairly poetry with our like rhyming stuff, right? Um, Neither purpose nor calling was of consequential matter, be they hero, villain, or passerby. Some day those had unwillingly come to, and some day those would inadvertently come to perish. Like this stuff feels pretty poetry. So I like how this toes the line of prose and poetry, and I mean, I think that probably bodes well for if you continue to write prose, right, that I think you seem to have a very good capacity to make prose uh, poetic. Um, and I think that can be good sometimes if it's done well. Like I don't think purple prose has to be like bad, right? At least from a personal preference kind of direction. Um, it is scary, but is very valuable to see how other artists view and ingest your art. Yeah, yeah, that's very true. There are a bunch of places where it's super poetry esque, like later on. I can't recall the line. There are points where there are multiple words in the row at the same time. Yeah, yeah, this like recall was thereafter hereafter. Um there's even some of the stuff at the end. Don't you see? The ending is foreseen. He who just is was soon to be no more. So I ask you, what is it for? Like we have so many cool kind of linguistic things happening there. Um, uh, the curtain call, the callous claim that did not differentiate amidst the parts played. So we have like alliteration stuff happening, right? There is a lot of poetic going on, right? And I think that's, I mean, yeah, yeah, it's cool. And I like the idea of surroundings going into one. See and scene, for instance. Yeah, I'm mostly writing novels at the moment, with some poetic lines here and there. Dope. Yeah, I think it'll be cool to read more of your stuff. If you do share. Uh, I'm occasionally inclined to read prose on stream, just straight up. Not always, but sometimes I manage. Uh, it usually looks a little different than the poetry, and it's much less in depth. But if you ever want to share prose, I mean, that interests me, right? Fully agree. I will send some stuff on the Discord later. I'm actually quite open to criticism, even if super harsh. That's good. I'm glad for that for you, Reclusi. Uh, yeah, all good when there is time. I just enjoy seeing people react to my stuff. If I write something fun, I shall share it too. Awesome. Can't wait. I'm glad you found this interesting and maybe beneficial to face your fear. I legit think this could be cut in a fashion that could present a coherent and strong piece of poetry. But as I mentioned earlier, asking any author to cut work is a lot to ask. Yeah, I mean, it can also just be beneficial to tell an author, if this was my poem, here are the things I would cut, or here are the things that I find least necessary. Like, I think those extremes of like, this is my least favorite part of the poem, this is my absolute favorite part of the poem that I love, right? These are really helpful things to an author, and at least when we're in the right spaces and with some amount of like justification, I think it can be a little harsh to read something and just say nothing else and just be like, oh, I think we should just like cut these things. Um, because I do think like there's a human element of, here's the things I like, here's the thing I don't. Um, Sort of that tempering is um, kind, at least, right? But yeah, I do like that point. Face my fear. Is it? Trust me, I throw away a lot of good lines on the daily. I think it's a very very prevalent thing to throw away lines and to cut things. And Reclusi, as far as I know, you're someone who iterates very heavily on your poetry. So, you know, cutting lines is a necessary evil, a tragic inevitability. Um, so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing uh, to suggest someone do. I think that's all for this poem. Um, unless anyone jumps in with thoughts before I can like slowly scroll back to the top of this and start reading to read the whole thing again, right? Um, yeah, seems like we're settled. Wait a second. Okay, we're not done. That's fine. Um, could you try reading it with a bit of a British accent? um, right. No, that's Australian. British. A little bit of a British accent. Can I do a British accent? Possibly. I think that's a little bit like I don't like doing accents just to for the sake of it because I feel like one I'm not very good at them and it feels like I'm mocking the culture at that point. Um oh gosh. And now I sound South African. See, that's the issue, right? Like I I don't think I will British. No. um I no. um I don't find it I don't usually like doing accents as, doing accents. I could try to capture it real quick if that fits. Um to be fair, South Africa was a British colony. Yeah, so was Australia. So they like the first thing I said was very Australian. Um you can go on to the next. This is actually the only poem we're reading today. So we're gonna read this one and then like that's gonna be I think that's just gonna be it, I guess. Um, cause I got places to be. But I'm German. But yeah, maybe you'll get more of my intended flow. I'm not sure. um, let me speak it then into my thread if that's cool with you. Uh, sure. Um, I have an impending ad break from Twitch, which is really annoying, but I'm gonna run the ad break and then maybe we can just come back and wrap up this poem and that gives us time for a few more thoughts if we have any. And then to like properly wrap up stream. It's just I have this annoying ad coming in. So we'll come back in 3 minutes for a little bit more stream. Uh and we'll end at like 2 in like half an hour or something. Um, but yeah, uh, take a quick break, stand up, drink water, move away from the screen, rest your mind. I'll be back in a second.